it's not good to fail profitably.
Oh, wow. Okay. Tell me more.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, my name is Michiel Boere.
And today we have a very special topic for you. As startup founders, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about product, users, having an impact, changing the world. But underlying all of that is a raw truth. Startups are about money. They run on money and ultimately are expected to make money, and lots of it. Which means that money and finance is something that not even the most idealistic founder can afford to ignore. Finance is so much more than accounting, though. The best founders know how to get the most out of their capital in a deeply strategic way. How do they do that? Well, that's what this episode is about. And to teach us, I'm joined by a very special guest. We'll meet him right after this break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001 and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. Michiel Boere is the CFO of Remote, a company making it easier for startups to hire and pay people anywhere in the world. Remote has been an absolute growth monster, raising hundreds of millions of dollars from top investors like SoftBank, Accel, Sequoia, Index Ventures, and General Catalyst. Wow, that's quite a list. Before Remote, Michiel had an incredible career at Uber, getting deep into the business across multiple roles, culminating as VP and CFO for Uber Eats. Quite an incredible resume, which makes me very excited to learn from Michiel about how to do finance as a startup founder. Michiel, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. We're excited to have you. So, tell me a little bit about what's driven you through your career and how you actually have ended up where you are.
Yes, well, I've always liked just the challenge of doing something difficult. So in the beginning, I actually studied physics, but I did realize quite quickly I was not going to be a physicist for life. Then my first job was in a consulting firm where I learned for the first time actually how business works. And then I was recruited into a small Dutch e-commerce company as a CFO. It was my first CFO job. I, quite frankly, didn't really know what to do. But you know, you just figure it out along the way. It was a small company, relatively speaking. And then at some point, I joined Uber in a marketing capacity. I was going to join there in a finance role, but it was chaos in the beginning of Uber. I was excited to join and said, I'll do whatever you want to do. I did CRM, performance marketing, analytics, but eventually found my way back into finance. I was CFO of Uber Eats for a while. And then 2 years ago, I joined Remote as CFO. We are an HR tech platform, and we help businesses to find, manage, and pay employees all over the world. And we help, and I'm particularly excited about that, we help talent located everywhere around the world in every country to find great jobs and to find employment opportunities at great tech companies everywhere.
I love the non-linear career path and, that the fact that you just jumped into a marketing role because you wanted to work at Uber and that's what was there. So I guess I'd start generally with what, in your view, do you wish that every founder knew about finance and how to apply it in their role?
Well, finance, in the end, is not rocket science. If you think about the different disciplines, so to speak, that a founder will have to get versed in, like engineering and products and legal, finance is probably the one where they can do it on the side, or they think they can do it on the side for quite a while. That is generally fine, as long as you are aware of some of the pitfalls and you hire the right people at the right time. There's two things that I would caution a founder not to start too late in terms of finance. One is hiring a good controller. A controller is someone who essentially does the books for you, who does accounting, and who makes sure that your financial reporting obligations are done on time. And the other person is, and this depends a little bit on the complexity of your business, is someone who understands tax. And you can hire that person internally, or you can use an external tax advisor. But those two disciplines are probably the ones that founders, I would say, would struggle to do themselves for a while. The rest of finance, so when we talk about fundraising or strategic finance, FP&A, understanding the unit economics of your product are things that you can do for a while yourself.
Okay, so I'd love to dive into a few of those things because I think, you've talked about the tactical and then the strategic side of finance, right? And I think the tactical side is really important, right? Like once you start having any complexity in your business, you start to find that money comes and money goes, and it can be hard to keep track of. And, I think this is a hard lesson to learn the first time, because if you come from, a less entrepreneurial background and you're used to having relatively simple household finances, you think, how hard can it be? Money comes in, money goes out. But actually it gets really complicated, and just knowing where you stand, making sure that you understand, your runway and that your spending is not out of control and that you're spending money on the right thing and that you're collecting on your invoices, all of this stuff that a financial controller does. Really important just to get that right. And tax, absolutely. That's a specialization that I don't think an early stage founder needs to worry about. But I am interested to sort of dive into a little bit more of that strategic side, which you said, many founders can perhaps handle on their own. And I agree. But, one of the fascinating things about being a founder, I said this to you before we started recording, is that it's the ultimate generalist role. You need to understand so many different things to do the job well. But everybody comes from some background. They used to be more specialized, and now they're coming into a founder. So there are things they know well. There are things they don't know so well. And so I think you may be right. If somebody comes from more of a consulting or accounting or commercial background, then some of this stuff is fairly obvious. You say FP&A, unit economics and things like that. But let's say you're a founder who comes more from a technology and product side of things, from design, from from operations. And sometimes this stuff is less obvious. So I think maybe it is worth diving into a little bit about, I guess the FP&A, cash flow, and I think the most interesting thing for me, and I know we're going to come back to this, is unit economics and, basically the difference between fixed costs and marginal costs and how that's so important when you're trying to build a startup.
So let's start with that. Let's start with unit economics. And in my experience, there's actually two things that people talk about when they talk about unit economics. One is so-called the unit P&L, which is essentially the P&L of one unit of your product. And two is the sales efficiency or the go-to-market economics, or sometimes what's called the CAC over LTV discussion. So the customer acquisition cost compared to the lifetime value of a customer. So let's tackle them one by one, right? So first is the unit P&L, I would say. This is the best thought of if you, for example, think about Uber, where I was previously, you would think about one trip. Like, what is the cost of one trip? How much do we get out of one trip? What is our commission on that one trip? What's the average bookings of one trip? What are sort of the variable costs that we have, payment costs, customer support, etc. And what is then the marginal contribution that is left, or the gross margin, if you want to call it that, of just one trip after deducting the variable cost? And then you can have a view of how that will develop over time. So having a good view of your unit economics on a unit P&L of one product is very, very important. Then what you're left with on gross margin there is essentially what you can spend on everything else in your company. Primary thing you have to spend it on is on sales and marketing, because you have to get more and more customers or sell more and more units of this product. So you have to understand then how much do I have to spend on marketing and sales to get one more unit of this product, and how much is then left for everything else in my company. So understanding that dynamic in the P&L of your product is probably the one thing that I would urge founders to do right from the outset. It also influences things like pricing.
I completely agree. And, this is one of the things that is so important to understand, is that, if you talk about a venture-backed startup, and, it doesn't get much more venture-backed than Uber, right? The headlines are always, this company is losing money. And on an accounting level, every year for, I think, well over a decade, Uber lost money. And if you raise capital as an early stage startup, why do you raise capital? It's so that you can spend it. And in an accounting sense, that is losing it, right? So you're running at a loss. And what that can lead to, if you're not careful, is a sort of a lack of discipline. When you say, of course we're losing money, so we don't have to worry about that fact. We're a startup. That's the whole point of being a startup, is that we lose money. But the truth is, you lose that money in a really strategic way, because you are focusing on R&D and on these other growth loops, as you say, Michiel. And the idea is that eventually you become very, very profitable, right? But that eventually is only true if the unit economics are right. There's that old joke that, anybody can sell $1 for 90 cents. Like that's the ultimate negative unit economics, right? It's true. And many fintechs fell for that, for pretty much selling $1 for 90 cents. So the difference between, just a cash incinerator and a cash volcano, ultimately, in the long term, is really those unit economics, right? That's the difference between an Uber or an Amazon, which looked terrible for a long time, on traditional accounting metrics, but eventually became these juggernauts. It all comes down to those unit economics. And that's why, you have to be thinking about that early on, or you could just be creating, like I said, a cash incinerator and not even realizing it.
Yes, and many people on the outside are confused about that. From the outside looking into a company, you only see the average, right? You only see the average of all their products. But what you don't see is that actually and for example, in the case of Uber, but in the case of Amazon, it's a similar story, is that, on 4 out of 5 orders, they are already profitable. And it's just on 1 out of 5, they are losing a lot because they're giving discounts away there, because they're trying to increase their market share. So what you see from the outside is, hey, this company is wildly unprofitable. There must be something wrong with it. Whereas from the inside, you can see that many units of their product are already very profitable. And in the case of Uber also, for example, many countries were profitable way before the company itself was profitable. But from the outside, you could not see that. You saw just one big pile of unprofitable business.
Right. And this is like, there's a lot of nuance there, right? Because, yeah, I mean, what you're saying is a typical ride was profitable, but then 1 out of 5 was massively unprofitable. Why? Because you'd applied a promotion. And I think it's reasonable in your modeling to say, in that case, that promotion is a marketing expense, right? You've done that in order to grow. So it's not that the ride was unprofitable. It's that you have a profitable ride that happens to carry this marketing expense on top of it. And so it's actually important to tease this stuff out. And, I don't come from this background at all. So the reason I'm able to talk about it even a little bit is because I've learned how important it is to be able to tease these things out. And, it's more than just playing games. It's actually fundamental to the feasibility of your business to attribute these different costs properly, so you can really understand what are your, I guess what you'd say, your core or fundamental unit economics.
And there's one thing I would disagree with there potentially. So there are two opposing views, I would say, on these discounts and promotions. One view is that they're essentially, to your point, a marketing cost. Often they are, in many situations they are. You could view them as such. They could be a customer acquisition cost, especially if it's the first discount that someone gets upon doing their first order. But a different way to look at it, and that's where we leaned towards more over time as the business matured, is to look at promotions as a way to do price differentiation in a world where price differentiation is very difficult. Before I joined Uber, I was actually CFO of a Dutch e-commerce company, and we were selling greeting cards and gifts. One of the things we did, we had some days where we would apply a free shipping discount. It was a big campaign. We would send it out to all of our customers, our entire customer base. We'd say, today's free shipping. If you did that with just like that, and you said today's free shipping, everyone would just get a discount. If you said today's free shipping, but use this promo code in your shopping cart when you check out, and then you get free shipping, you could send that to everyone. You could plaster it all over the website, and still only about half of the people would use that promo code in the shopping cart, which means that it's essentially a price differentiation tool between where you give discounts to people who are very sensitive to price, who read their emails about price, who look for discounts on the website, and you would not give it away to people who just quickly want to do an order and want to get out as soon as possible. That creates a way to maximize your revenue in a different way.
Yeah, what that reminds me of, I don't know if you had these in the Netherlands, but in Australia, we used to have these mail-in rebates, right? Where something would be like, buy this vacuum cleaner, right? $100 off mail-in rebate. And what that means is you buy the vacuum cleaner, then you need to fill in the form, you need to post it back to the company, then they post you, I think it was a paper check that you then have to take to the bank and cash. And of course, there were no eligibility criteria. If you bought the thing, you were entitled to the rebate. And when I was younger, I didn't understand why they made such a big fuss instead of just giving you $100 off. But it's exactly what you say is, the actual redemption rates on those things were pretty low because they deliberately introduced a lot of friction to the whole process. And that's a classic differentiation. I know in the US, coupons are a big thing as well.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also part of why gift cards work, right? The breakage on that is huge. So much does not get used of a gift card. Same with subscriptions, right? So if you have a subscription, the breakage on that is also very high with people having their subscription and not using it.
But this is the fascinating stuff. And, this is the sort of thing, Michiel, that I learnt over the years at startups that, is probably obvious to you coming from your background, but as a founder is profound and is at the heart of what I feel is sort of strategic about finance. Like a term like breakage. I only learned it a few years ago, right? Breakage in the case of a gift card is someone buys a gift card but doesn't actually spend it. Well, you do a few accounting tricks and then that's free money straight to the bottom line. Right. I believe Starbucks has 12% breakage on their gift cards. That's insane.
Yes.
They're getting a loan at a minus 12% interest rate because also that's the other thing. Cash flow cycles are great with gift cards. You get the money now, it gets spent later. These are all things that might seem very dry, but can be the difference between a mediocre business and an absolutely epic business. So, I think what every founder should understand, I think this is what you're saying, Michiel, is that, understanding the nuts and bolts of really detailed accounting, financial control, tax law and so on, and, just all the tax paperwork. You don't need to know that. But it definitely behooves you to learn things like breakage, like working capital requirements, modeling, unit economics, forecasting, because if you don't know about these things, at least at a, intermediate level, then you're kind of flying blind in terms of whether your startup is a not-for-profit or a business.
Yes, exactly. And the first things that you mentioned are things exactly that you can outsource or you can hire people for. And the second things that you mentioned, such as pricing, your unit economics, go-to-market efficiency, things like that, are things that you need to understand yourself to some extent. And eventually, you may hire a CFO that helps you with that. But it's fundamentally on the founder, I think, also to get a good understanding of their underlying economics on that.
Yeah. I mean, actually, now that you mention this wasn't on our agenda, but I'm interested if you have thoughts on fractional CFOs, because I think, that's quite a trend these days is for companies to bring on fractional CFOs relatively early on. And, I guess the idea is, yes, you have someone who gets the basics of what it means to do finance strategically. They don't need to be working with you full time because, the business isn't that complex, but they can point you in the right direction and make sure that you're not making any stupid mistakes. Is that something that you see as valuable or not so much?
I think it's absolutely valuable if you think about it the right way, right? The way you think about it, from my perspective, it is a good advisor that you have. I would not think of it as your CFO or your part-time CFO, because ultimately they're not on the team, right? They're not in the weeds every day, having to make the difficult trade-offs. They're always a little bit on the sidelines, especially if it's only 1 or 2 days a week. So see it as an advisor, see it as someone who can make sure you hire the right person at the right time. And they will, if they're good, they'll advise you to hire the right person at the right time, but don't see it as a replacement for a CFO when in reality you already need one.
We'll come back to that. So one of the things that I know that you have thoughts on that really piqued my interest is applying risk-based finance to high growth companies. And I think you've described yourself as a risk-on CFO. What do you mean by that? I'm fascinated by the concept of risk and how people think of it.
I think it boils down to the fact that one thing I've realized early on is that it's much easier to solve a financial challenge than a growth problem. Let me try to explain what I mean with that. Okay, so it is much easier to have a product that scales, that is financially not in a good place yet. You have to figure out a way to make it in a financial good place, right? To improve the economics, improve the pricing, etc. If there is underlying growth, if there is product market fit. It's much easier to do that than to have a growth problem, which is you have a perfectly sound financial model for your product. It's just not taking off. Now that sounds obvious, but you'll have a lot of CFOs who want to fix the finances of a product right from the outset, and therefore they prevent a lot of potential good products to scale and to fix it later. You also see them as blockers early on in the product development process and the launch process, right? So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to really look at products differently depending on where they are in their life cycle. At Remote, currently, we have a few different products. Some are quite mature, some are quite new. The new ones get a different treatment. I'm looking there for leading indicators of product market fit, of demand, of willingness to pay from customers for this. And whether they can currently show positive unit economics or whether they can show a path to profitability is less of a concern to me, because once they hit volume, we can then tweak many of the things that are needed to make this a sustainable business. Some would describe that as a risk-on CFO, because I tolerate loss-making businesses quite a bit, as long as they're small and they're sort of trying to figure out how to become big.
So a question for you, and then I'd love to reflect a little bit, but like you said, a lot of people describe that as risk on, which is a careful choice of phrase. Do you consider that to be risk on? And if not, how would you view it?
I think in product development, you have this famous triangle, right, between speed, cost, and quality, where you can only pick one or two.
Fast, cheap, good.
Exactly, right? So in finance, or maybe more generally in business, it's not a triangle. It's more like a one-dimensional line of risk reward, right? So you have to tolerate some level of risk to get reward that other folks don't get. If there's no risk, there's no reward left, because everyone would have already gotten it. I mean, you see this in the stock market. Higher risk stocks on average give higher returns, right? So it's not a new thing. It would be easy, and I think it would be a mistake if you have a CFO who simply tries to reduce a risk as part of their job, because then they're also not optimizing for long-term outcomes, I think, for the company.
Yeah, and to me, that actually what it comes down to is when you talk about risk, it's a question of risk of what, right? When you talk about risk, it's always in the context of a particular adverse outcome. And I think if you're in a startup, actually the adverse outcome that you're talking about is just a failure to reach that massive level of scale, to your point, right? Like Jeff Bezos said that in all of his investor letters, he's been very consistent about this. He said that what he's optimizing for is net present value of future free cash flow per share, right? So it's a super long-term view. It's saying the reason we have this sort of Silicon Valley VC-funded loss-making startup model is because we know we're going to lose money now, but because of the unit economics that we have and the scale that we can achieve, in the future, we will be printing huge amounts of money. And that is what we're doing it for. And so in a sense, the risk is that we never get there, right? The risk isn't that we lose too much money. The risk is that we fail to achieve scale. And, you get companies that get caught in this sort of zombie zone where they're growing 10% a year and they're not quite profitable or they're barely profitable. That is a really major problem. It's not what anybody wants. And there's this slightly trite advice in tech, which is like, the only thing worse than failing fast is failing slowly, right? So in a sense, if the risk is failing slowly, then what you are talking about is not the risk-on thing to do. It's the prudent and sensible thing to do.
Yeah. And maybe then to put another spin on that, it's not good to fail profitably.
Oh, wow. Okay. Tell me more.
Right. So you don't get a medal for profitability in the VC tech world, right? You get, exactly to your point, you have to optimize for long-term free cash flows per share, which means that you have to grow. Like, you do not get a medal for profitability now if you don't grow. You have to grow. You have to understand what it would mean to become profitable, what you would have to do to become profitable. Becoming profitable now usually means, if you're backed by VCs and you're profitable now, usually means that you're not optimized because you're not growing fast enough. And you should be growing faster. You should be using some of the cash that you have to actually grow faster and get there faster. That is the prudent financial thing to do, even from a purely rational way of optimizing future cash flows.
Exactly. If you'll allow me a metaphor, imagine you're a motorcycle daredevil. You're trying to jump over 100 meters worth of cars or jump over a 100-meter cliff, let's say, right? What's the prudent thing to do? Is it to sort of slowly accelerate and make sure you're always in control of your bike? Or is it to go full throttle and reach maximum speed before you jump off that cliff edge, right? Because there's only one good outcome, which is to make it to the other side. If you fall halfway because you've been accelerating slowly, then that's the risky thing to do. And, I think that's where sometimes there's a cultural mismatch. I don't know if you've seen this, Michiel. Like if you bring in CFOs or financial folks who come from maybe more traditional industry, and they want to try to manage risk, they often don't understand that they've actually joined a company that has signed up to this daredevil cliff jump, and so they take the wrong approach to managing risk.
And maybe a business example of that would be, in the past, I sometimes shut down a country. It's very difficult to do that. It's very painful for the team. painful for customers. But at some point, sometimes you decide that. But until you decide that you shut down a company, you don't shut down a company. And what I mean with that is that you go, to your point, you go full throttle in that country until you make the decision not to, right? You can't be half into it, because then you're just prolonging the way to get there, and you don't actually have any chance of success. So you have to actually go for maximum speed until you decide to just completely stop. But there's no middle ground there.
Yeah, just to put that bow on it, right? The real risk is to seek the middle ground that doesn't exist.
Yes.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Okay, cool. So I think that's really good. And this is something that, I hope every founder and every potential, if we have potential founders, CFOs listening, like this is really the important understanding of risk. We often say on this podcast, know the game you're playing. This is the game that you're playing if you're in the venture-backed startup game. I wanted to pivot a little bit to, I guess, the question of planning, budgeting, and forecasting. I guess 3 traditional activities of a CFO and in finance. How do you see these applying in a startup? And I guess one of the things that I've always struggled with is in a world of enormous uncertainty, which is especially at the earlier stages where you're at in a startup, how do you even approach these exercises when there's so much you don't know?
I think the most important of the 3 is actually forecasting. And one thing that people sometimes think is that you only forecast once a quarter or even once a year. No, you should forecast as often as you materially change your forecast. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, when I was in ride sharing at Uber, we would forecast twice a week the business. And actually we were thinking of forecasting every day, because the business, in the first couple of weeks, the business changed so fast that every single day we would have new facts and new data on how the business was doing. We could make a new forecast of where we thought this was going to and how much our business was going to go down and how fast it would pick up again. Now, all these forecasts were horribly wrong. I remember in the beginning, in the early days, we thought, maybe our business will go down 10%. That would be a loss. 4 days later, we said, okay, it's now down 15%. Do we think it will go down to 30? And then 1 week later, it was down 50%. And we would say, how far will this go? But I do think that forecasting was very helpful, because it meant we could take quick decisions based on the latest data. So I would, of the 3 that you mentioned, planning, forecasting, and budgeting, I think forecasting is the most important. And forecasting should not be a wishful thinking. Forecasting should be what you actually think is going to happen. I've had my team sometimes present forecasts to me that were like, well, we put this in there because that's still the budget line. Like, no. I want to know what you think is actually going to happen, because that's what I would call a forecast.
You talked about the fact that during COVID, you reforecast very frequently. Forecasts, even then, were still wrong, and yet you found them immensely useful. So I'd love it if you could add a bit more color and context, because, I think part of my engineer brain says if you have a forecast that's not accurate, it's not accurate. In what way is it useful?
So the forecast, that forecasts are not going to be accurate, but that at least the forecast is a potential and hopefully on average accurate way of looking at it. One of the things I did with my teams is that I would look at our previous forecast and plot them all. We were always wrong, of course, but I said, how often are we wrong because we did better, and how often are we wrong because we did worse? And I want it to be 50-50.
Yes.
If it's not 50-50, we don't have what I would call P50 forecast. P50, so the 50th percentile, right? And we want a P50 forecast. We want a 50% forecast where on average we will be right. Where we're as often wrong to the upside as wrong to the downside. Because that's what we think is actually going to happen, and that's what we can then take actions on. So that is not a downside scenario. It's not a rosy scenario either, but it's what we actually think is going to happen at that moment in time.
So if a company sometimes talks about, we always beat our forecasts, and they congratulate themselves on that, what that means is they're bad at forecasting.
Exactly. That's terrible, right? And the plan, at least the plan, it's wrong, right? The forecast, you're like, well, on average, we should be right. But the plan usually is made somewhere in November. The financial plan for the next year is usually finalized somewhere in November. And you know for sure it's wrong, just like a forecast at that time will be wrong. But then by January 1st, you already know the plan is wrong in these ways, right? So it's not on average, you're right anymore plan. So you should view it as an aspirational target at that point, but not pretend that that is the world in which you're living and that is the world in which you can somehow get back to on some lines. Like, because what's bad if it happens is that some people still follow the financial plan, especially on hiring and on spending, whereas the reality is not reality of things that happen like on your revenue line or your customer line. They're not at all anymore in line with the plan.
So, I mean, this is the interesting thing to me. Like all of these things, forecasts, plan, budgets, the right way to think of them, I think, is as tools, right? And a tool, well, the definition of a tool is something that you use to help you achieve some sort of goal. And so I'm still asking this for myself because I feel I have a broad understanding, but not a very deep understanding of what is the use of these tools in practice. Because, even when you say like, we use these forecasts, if they're on average, they're correct, they're really helpful. Like maybe even if you're able to add a bit more color to that, like let's say you're at a startup, you're producing forecasts, how do they get used as a tool in helping aid decision-making and operations within the business?
So a forecast is used by some parts of your business. For example, your customer service department. Depending on what your product is, you have some type of customer service department. And your forecast should be what you give them, right? They're like, well, this is the most likely outcome of how many units we're going to sell and i.e. what you should plan for in terms of volume, right? And we know we can be off on either side, and you have to have plans in place on like, what do you do if it's much more? What do you do if it's much less? A forecast is very useful for departments like that. A forecast is not a target. Don't get me wrong, right? The targets for your sales department or for your product managers can be much higher. It can be the original financial plan. It can be any number you pull out of thin air at some point in time. It can be an aspirational target. The forecast is not a target. The forecast is just what you actually think is going to happen. You don't even need to share it with everyone, but it's very important that as a founder, you and your CFO are aligned on like whatever we set out there in terms of targets for our teams, we should steer them on it and we should push them to reach those targets. But our current forecast is that we're going to do X. So we need to make sure that we are planning for our finances to be okay in X, not just if we hit our targets.
The reason I'm asking this stuff is partly for myself, but partly because I think I see quite often what I would nearly call like finance cosplay, right? Where you have organizations that have sort of gotten this received wisdom that you should have a budget, you should have a plan, you should have a forecast, but because they don't treat them as tools, they don't really know what they do with these things. So it's nearly this empty exercise of filling up a bunch of numbers in spreadsheets and then going, oh, well, we didn't meet the forecast, or we did, or we beat it, or we didn't beat it. But it's like, it doesn't have utility, right? Because it doesn't actually affect how the business is run. And I think to me, and I'd love to get your take and whether you agree or disagree, these things are only as valuable as the degree to which they actually get used in the decision-making and the operations of the business.
Maybe one example, right? So sometimes you'll see many teams compare their results to a forecast or compare their results to a financial plan at a point in time. They'll say like, last month we did 7% under plan and 3% above the forecast. And I find that quite useless because without a longitudinal view of it, it doesn't say much that you were 7% under plan, right? And what do I mean with the longitudinal view of it? It's much more helpful if you have a 24-month view, let's say 18 months back and 6 months forward of how do we actually do? What were our actuals in the past? What is our plan going forward from now on? What is our forecast? And then track every month, put another dot on the graph to see how you're doing. And then you can see, are we deviating from our plan? In which direction? Is the gap getting bigger or is the gap getting smaller? And then you have it in context, and then you use the plan as a tool to track whether you're on the right trajectory, essentially. But you have to look at sort of longitudinal views. If you just look at a sliver in time and a 1 month comparison, data point comparison of how did we do versus plan, it's actually not that meaningful.
Do you think there is a stage of startup, an early stage, where you would say doing this stuff, financial planning and forecasting, that it's too early? Or is it always a good discipline to have in some form?
It is always important for the finance function because the most important rule in finance is that you should never ever run out of cash. So you do need to have a forecast of how your cash is going to develop at every stage in the company. So even if a founder on day one, you look at your bank account and you haven't even started yet, you need to understand how long can I do what I'm currently doing, which is building my product, until I have to make different decisions, right? And as soon as you raise your first round, same thing. You need to every week understand how long can we keep on doing what we're currently doing? What's my forecast? What do I think is actually going to happen? Not the target, forecast. And what does that mean for how long I can continue doing what I'm doing with the current cash pile? So yes, I think you need it at every point.
I think that's really valuable. And, you've hit the nail on the head, I think, which is, what do early stage founders care about a lot is runway. And that's what you're describing, right?
Yes.
Runway is how many months until you run out of money. And, like I said, first rule of finance, don't run out of money. Second rule of finance, don't run out of money. And the runway is so important, but it's tricky, right? Because I think people often treat runway as like, how much money did I spend this month? Or how much money did I lose this month? And how much money do I have in the bank, and divide one number by the other. But of course, that's extremely crude. I mean, you could say that's a forecast, but it's a low quality forecast. So if what you want to really do is figure out what is your cash burn down, that is, I guess, literally a forecast of, some element of your overall plan. And that's really valuable to understand because, I think even the definition of runway is kind of polluted, but it's really, again, a tool. Your runway should be your best understanding of how much time you have left. It's going to be wrong, to your point, but it's your best estimate, and it's something that's worth keeping up to date. You don't just do it once. If your business goes well, then your runway might get longer. If your expenses are higher than you were planning, your runway will get shorter. And then I think I'd also add, in the context of runway, some of that more accounting stuff around working capital and, receivables and collections and so on. You can think you've got money, but the difference between money on paper and in the P&L and then money in the cash flow statement can be the difference between actually being able to continue operating and having runway and actually being insolvent.
Yes, exactly.
So, a lot of the folks who are listening to this podcast are relatively early stage founders. They don't have a finance function. And to your point, they probably don't need one yet. They are the finance function. So, if you were to advise them on what are just the core things that you should be keeping on top of and understanding in order to be able to have some sort of reasonable forecast and make sure you don't run out of money, what would those things be?
Making a forecast does not have to be super complex, right? You can just do it in a spreadsheet. Look at your hiring plans. Most likely your hiring plans and your headcount will be your largest expense anyway. Your second largest expense will most likely be marketing, especially in the beginning. It's going to be online marketing, maybe some cloud. So you should just simply put that in a spreadsheet, forecast it out a few months or a few quarters, depending on your timeline, and plot it against your revenue. The revenue, I would build it up very, very, very simply from customers and RPU or revenue per customer, and then build a very small model from there. Right, modeling I think is what every founder should be able to understand and be able to do themselves. And you can develop that model over time, and it will develop over time. It will probably become a Frankenstein model at some point, and you have to start over again. But that's it's as simple as that.
As simple as that, or as complex as that. And I think that's maybe the key takeaway that I think is worth leaving with, is that you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here, right? Because like I said, I think a lot of founders feel overwhelmed. This is not where they come from. And forecasts are one of those things, as you say, that you can always add more and more variables, more and more nuance to. Over time, you reduce the bias, you reduce the noise, you get more and more accurate predictions. But what you really want to do is say, whatever level of accuracy of prediction I have the skills to create, that's better than not having that, right? Like,
Totally.
Just to sort of go to runway, right? Like, even if I'm going to hire someone next month, I can build that into my model so I know my burn rate's going to increase. That's already better than just taking cash in the bank and dividing it by how much money I spent this month. So it's incremental, isn't it? And you can add to your model and add to your model. And I think that's when you're referring to the Frankenstein's monster, at a certain point, the model becomes a hot mess and you need to start again. But again, think of it as a tool. I'm a software engineer by background, and it's like writing code. And, one of the big differences between being at a big company and being an early stage startup is, you just do not want to get paralyzed by all the things you don't know how to do, or you don't have the resources to do as well as you'd like. You've just got to do the best with the resources you have. And I think having this forecast, understanding how you sit financially, you just don't want to be paralyzed by what you can't do what you can.
You cannot not do it. You have to have a forecast, however rudimentary.
You can not do it. I know
simple.
plenty of founders who don't do it. But it's just a bad idea. One of the other things I wanted to touch on is, I think you've made the controversial statement that traditional budgets, you're not a big fan of them. They often lead to wasted spend and missed opportunities. So again, thinking of a budget as a tool, like how do you think it is misused, and where is the role of budgets?
Yeah, so a budget, if you think about it, what is a budget, right? A budget is a line item in your financial plan. Sometimes, or actually quite often, teams misinterpret that line in their financial plan, their budget. They misinterpret it as being an accrual to spend. If the line item for the cost of your team in the financial plan is, let's say, $1 million, people will say, my budget is $1 million. And they then think that that is some kind of implicit approval, pre-approval to spend that amount of money. That's where it goes wrong. And it goes a little bit back to our discussion about what is financial planning, what is forecasting. The fact that we've put 1 million in there just means that, hey, we think that this is a likely scenario, or we think that this is the target scenario where we're going to spend 1 million on this. Now, if that team actually wants to do something and wants to buy a tool or wants to spend it on marketing or anything you want, they still need to justify that spend. It can't be, we have 1 million, so we can spend it now without any justification. So what I've heard too many times in the past is that a team would come with a proposal to spend on something, and they would say, don't worry, it's in the budget. And that's when I start to worry. I'm like, well, what do you mean it's in the budget? Yeah, we have room for this in our budget. I'm like, well, but is it a good idea? Should we do this? Is it like, what's the ROI of these dollars that you're spending on X, Y, and Z? So a budget often leads to decisions that are not optimal because people are going to lower their bar to justify the spend as long as it's in the budget. And people are going to actually increase the bar for return on investment of dollars that are not in the budget, which is also not optimal. So if you manage by budgets, then you make, I think, on average, suboptimal decisions. And I'll add a different example to it. In a previous company, we were managing a portfolio of countries. Some countries would overperform, and they would essentially do better on profit or on EBITDA or on whatever metric. They would be like, well, I'm overperforming versus my budget, versus my target. So I'm going to spend the extra money on something. Usually spend it on things that they can spend it as fast as possible on, which is marketing or headcount.
Spending money is fun.
Great, right? And they were like, well, I have more money left because I overperformed, so I'm going to spend it on something and I can still reach my budget. The countries that underperformed didn't have that luxury. They just underperformed. They came to me and said, hey, we didn't reach our target, so we are short money. Sorry, we didn't reach our EBITDA goal. We're burning more money than we thought we would burn. So we looked at it and we said, well, this doesn't work. I need the pluses to cover the minuses. Otherwise, at the total company level, it doesn't work.
Because the countries that are underperforming don't say, oh, well, then we'll voluntarily cut our budget, right? They'll still spend their full budget.
Exactly.
Still,
or they don't even have them. Sometimes they don't even have the option to do that, right? They'll miss their top line revenue target by half, and there's no way that they can get back to their profit target. So we realized this is not going to work. We need the pluses to cover the minuses, and we don't know in advance which countries are going to overperform and which are going to underperform, but we need the pluses to cover the minuses. Otherwise, at the total company level, it's not going to work. So we had to make a gentleman's agreement that, hey, if you, for some reason, have money left, you need to give it back, because that's the only way I can guarantee that, not even guarantee, but I can increase the chances that if you are short, that I can give you more through that mechanism.
To take a step back, like you said, these are the challenges with a budget-based system, and I agree with them. But what is an alternative that you can take maybe early on, where you still maintain that financial discipline, you still know, to your point, that you're not going to run out of money, but you're able to make smart investments rather than kind of trying to fit things into these pre-allocated like blocks of spending?
It depends on the department and it depends on the type of spend. With the marketing team, I think the best way of operating is to have a discussion with them every so often, so every month or every quarter, where you look forward and you say, hey, going forward, what's the level of commitment that we have on spend? And they might say, hey, we have in the next 4 quarters, if we just plot it, we've got $2 million spent committed. Then we've got another 3 million that is not committed yet, but we're making plans for that. And then there's another 5 million that is quote unquote in our budget that we haven't made plans for yet. If you have that discussion very often, then you can, in your continuous decision making, you can use that information. You can say, well, if we want to spend more, spend less on marketing, this is what they've already committed. This is what we can reduce. This is where we can increase potential. You can have a continuous discussion on whether we should spend more or less based on whether something works or not. That's likely more productive and leads to better outcomes than giving a fixed budget and having them use it or lose it, essentially. Because you also want it to go the other way around, right? So if you want to spend more money on, for example, marketing, you want to have the option to do that. And you don't want it to be a complete surprise for the team where they suddenly have to spend 2 million more and you know for sure it's not going to be efficient. So that's on the marketing side. Then on headcount, it's a little bit more difficult as well. In my experience, headcount is actually the most difficult area of the company to manage. It's very difficult to have people prove all the time, what is the business case for this additional person that I want to hire? But in places like, for example, your travel budget, I would actually not go with a budget at all and go with a policy of, hey, you should do what you think is best for the company and don't say much more than that. And just make sure that people are empowered to take responsible decisions.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, what this reminds me of, as we discuss, and we talk about these various things as tools, right? Budgets, plans, forecasts. I think maybe I came into this conversation, Michiel, with a bit too much of a like rigid view of these things, where it's like, you know, each of these things has a specific purpose. But what you're showing me, I think, and hopefully our audience, is that the reality is messier and more interesting, right? You know, there's this great quote, right? It's like, all maps are wrong, but some maps are useful.
Yes.
And this is what this reminds me of. Like, the budget is wrong. The plan is wrong. The forecast is wrong. But all of these things give you types of guardrails and handholds that allow you to navigate that really quite agile and changing space, which is, you know, you're making more money than you thought you would or less. You're spending more than you thought you would or less. All of these things. And in the meantime, you need to make sure that you don't run out of money and that you're making smart investment decisions. So all of these things can be brought in and out in ways that help with that. But don't lose sight of the fact that fundamentally you're trying to achieve 2 things, right? Not run out of money, make the best use of your capital. And if you keep that in mind, then the tools will fit into the appropriate place in that decision-making framework. So, you know, you're using the tool instead of, I guess, maybe what often happens with these financial tools is that the tool uses you. And maybe that's what you'd like to avoid.
Great ending. You just put together there.
That's great. That's why I love these conversations. I learn a lot by having them, and it connects neurons in my brain. So, Michiel, thanks so much for sharing all of that with us. I think it's been a real masterclass in how to think about finance and what are the real nuts and bolts of the finance toolkit and how founders can use them. Now, I think it's worth talking now a little bit about what you do at Remote. One of the things we want to think about is like, when's the right time to hire a CFO? And, you know, when is the complexity of what's done at the point where you need more help? I know one of the things that Remote does is take a lot of that off people's plates. So maybe talk a little bit about how Remote fits into the operating system of a startup and where that can help the most.
Yes, as a startup or as a scale up, at some point you want to expand internationally. Sometimes because you want to sell your product internationally or find customers elsewhere, but very often you look for talent outside of the country where you're based. You'll hire them wherever you can find the talent. And I've seen before that it gets very, very complex once you start to go international. And many startups hesitate to do that. You get into all kinds of legal tax challenges. So Remote does that, right? So we help our customers to expand their business internationally. And we help them with employer of record tool, with payroll, with contractor management, essentially one platform to do all your HR on. And what it means for me internally is that we have a team that essentially specializes in managing HR and financial complexity at scale across all countries, almost all countries around the world. So right now, my team is busy doing 50 financial audits in as many countries, thousands of VAT returns, etc. Just in order to manage that complexity and to manage that complexity at scale.
It's really important. Like, I think even through this conversation, the amount of complexity that startup founders have to deal with is already enormous. And, I think I'm completely with you on the huge potential of being able to hire globally as something that's good for both sides of that transaction. But the complexity is unnerving. And I think it's just been fantastic that tools like, or companies like Remote exist now that kind of abstract all of that away and do a lot of that hard work for you so you can focus on what actually matters, which is building your own startup.
Exactly.
Michiel, thanks again so much for your time. If people want to find out a bit more about you, what you do, your thinking, how can they best connect with you or learn more about you?
They can find me on LinkedIn, and they can always email me at my first name @remote.com.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure that, everyone listening will have gotten a huge amount out of that, as I have. So once again, really appreciate your time. Remote.com, if you want some help with hiring all over the world. Thanks again for your time. And folks, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.